What conspiracy theory do you believe 100%? Uesugi Kenshin. A Japanese daimyo, warlord, and one of the most powerful and cunning generals of his time. So much so that he was considered an avatar of the god of war. Was actually a woman. Let's look at some evidence that supports this. 1. Kenshin had severe stomach cramps on a monthly basis. Around the 10th of the month. He actually scheduled his military campaigns around this. 2. Kenshin's cause of death is recorded as a form of uterine cancer. By a doctor who made virtually no mistakes in the rest of the book that it's written in. 3. When the Uesugi were forced to relocate, they repeatedly took Kenshin's remains with them, and refused to tell even the shogun where he was interred. This rules out DNA testing. 4. Kenshin's personal tastes and appearance were consistently described in feminine terms, which, given the extreme subtleties of Japanese, is actually a bigger deal than it might seem. 5. Kenshin was the only man allowed by the shogun to wander among his harem. 6. Kenshin never married and never had children, although he did adopt. 7. He was described as beautiful with a very pale face and small features. Now the source for this theory is a pretty crazy historian, forgot his name, but I believe it and it's pretty interesting to think about. Someone knows what happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. I refuse to believe that nothing came up with modern technology. The huge search teams. And the time spent looking for its remains. The richest people in the world aren't interested in waving their dicks around the Forbes list. They don't want people to know how much money they have. Furthermore, everyone knows the most effective way to make money is to start with money. Invest. And compound over time. Therefore, the richest people would not be entrepreneurs that started a company less than 20 years ago. They would be families that became wealthy a long time ago. Say shortly after Napoleon's defeat. Well, I'm not so sure about believing it 100%. But one I think could be onto something is that the most ridiculous conspiracies are made up to cover up more plausible and possibly true ones. That there are mountain lions living wild in the forests on the East Coast states, but for some reason the government won't officially acknowledge them. I have just read too many stories of hunters, hikers, and farmers who have seen them. One theory I saw was that the government doesn't want people to try and hunt them, so act like they aren't there. I don't actually believe it. But I think it's 100% plausible that the NSA created Throwback Thursday to help develop facial recognition and aging software algorithms. David Stern rigged the 1985 NBA draft lottery in favor of the New York Knicks. Michael Jordan's flu game was food poisoning because of a pizza that a Salt Lake City pizzeria delivered to him so he wouldn't be able to play against the Utah Jazz later that day. Michael Jordan's first retirement was an 18-month suspension by the NBA due to his gambling. The NBA rigged the 2002 Western Conference Finals in favor of the Los Angeles Lakers. There's something at Area 51. Is it aliens? Probably not. UFO just stands for Unidentified Flying Object. Doesn't mean it's alien. Edit. I personally think it's the Lockheed Martin blimp as of late. From what I heard from my brother, it's pretty reasonable. They're trying to get it to go Mach 1. Which would make sense. Seeing something float up, then take off at the speed of sound would make people certainly think it's alien technology. That mattress firm is doing something weird. Edit. Mattress firm is some sort of giant money laundering scheme. They are everywhere and always empty. I remember seeing 4 mattress firms all on each corner of an intersection once. There is no way there is such a demand for mattresses. That Facebook is collecting microphone data to advertise to us. It's a theory I've seen people mention several times and I always just brushed it off. I work in the tech industry and have learned most people aren't even all that aware of what they're doing on their own computers. I always assumed the suspicious advertising was coming from search history. Or cookies embedded in people's devices. I was over at a friend's house and I mentioned my throat was sore and I might be coming down with something. She had just been given a large box of Emerald C vitamin juice powder packets. We had a lengthy conversation about the packets and how she got them. But until that moment it was a product I had never seen or heard of before. My phone was definitely on and in my hands during the conversation. I was sending information of where to meet up with someone for the next day. That conversation was over Messenger. I definitely didn't do any additional research into the emergency packets. By the time I got home that night, And for roughly 3 days afterwards. Emergency packets were heavily advertised to me over Facebook. I haven't really seen them since. But they were certainly prevalent for a short period of time immediately after the verbal conversation. Primates are not mysteriously harder to clone than other animals. There are cloned humans alive at this moment. I just find it oddly convenient that that can of worms is easily avoided by saying, "We can clone anything but monkeys and apes." JFK was never shot. His head just did that. That the U.S. had actionable and reliable information on the Pearl Harbor attacks and opted to not act on it. It's been well established that Roosevelt wanted to enter the war. He felt a moral imperative to. But the popular opinion was hard against it, and doing so would have been political suicide. The fact that our aircraft carriers weren't in port at the time and had been moved relatively recently makes me believe that Roosevelt saw this as an opportunity to get the casus belli he needed to shift public opinion while protecting the greater naval assets the U.S. had. The optimist in me wants to believe no leader would sacrifice thousands of his own people for political maneuvering. The pessimist in me recognizes that it probably happens all the time. I like to believe in the ancient nuclear war conspiracy. It is mostly based off of a story in the Mahabharata SP. An ancient Hindu text that described weapons that caused massive firestorms and caused the afflicted land to kill people outside of the fire. Describing these corpses as hairless and fingernailless, eerily similar to radiation poisoning cases, the theory has lots and lots of interesting coincidences. Even Oppenheimer was quoted to believe in ancient nukes, stating we were not the first to set off a nuke. He even quoted the Mahabharata upon the first bomb's detonation. Jordan's dad was killed because he refused to pay his gambling debts. And United 93 was shot down. That there are hot singles in my area. I personally know them. The hot dog and bun industry intentionally give you asymmetrical quantities to force you to buy more buns. Has anybody got dibs on posting this tomorrow? Is it okay if I do it? That Suge Knight injected Eazy-E with an AIDS needle. Now I am the first to admit that I know next to nothing about that stuff, but the fact that his pregnant fiancée didn't even have HIV is pretty telling. Suge Knight is a bad man. That H. Holmes is Jack the Ripper. He had a medical background. Was in England at the time of the Ripper murders. Had a huge interest in women's reproductive organs and liked to have them to try to figure out birth control. And most compelling, his handwriting matches the handwriting of the authentic Jack the Ripper letters. After he returned to America, the only murders that Jack the Ripper committed were completely different, savage, which makes most of us believe it was a poor copycat. In the 80s, the then Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated in the middle of a busy street. In the very center of Stockholm. He was very controversial, both inside and outside of Sweden. No one had ever been convicted of his murder. And there are so many weird things surrounding it. His wife was present during the assassination and saw the person. The police made so many mistakes with the investigation that it's almost comical. A couple of South African assassins were for some reason present in the country at the time. South Africa and Sweden were on very bad terms at the time because he was so outspoken against apartheid. There is also evidence that the CIA could have been involved because the US didn't like him either. Even closed down the American embassy there for a while. Even the Swedish intelligence agency have been accused of being responsible. The more you look into it, the sketchier it gets. There are so many theories that are possible that it's ridiculous. Although I'm not sure who did it. It's hard for me to believe that it's not some conspiracy involved. Milk isn't actually good for your bones, or at least not better than any other source of calcium. It's simply easier to advertise that way than milk keeps you from feeling sad in winter. That some Redditors keep posting the same tired old questions in AskReddit. Just for the karma. That the US government is controlled by big business and thus will never truly work in the best interests of the people, or even itself. Democrat or Republican. They have slightly different policies but still ultimately favor the ultra-rich over anything and everyone. I do not know when this will ultimately tip over. But you can't keep piling all the wealth at the very top. It's an upside-down pyramid. And at this point during the COVID-19 crisis they're not even trying to provide bread and circuses. The stimulus checks and unemployment are a band-aid and not a fix to a broken and crumbling foundation. I don't think that 9/11 was an inside job. But it was the golden opportunity that Dubia wanted to do what he pleased. He finished his dad's job and invaded Iraq. The people forgot the Enron scandal. Signed Patriot Law. And other laws that he revised as he saw fit. It didn't help that he threw the 9/11 card at anyone who criticized him.